Sigmund Freud, the great father of psychoanalysis, offered the idea that at the heart of human development and at the heart of human history, there is a drama which he called the Oedipus complex. The Oedipus complex, of course, follows the plot of the play Oedipus. The boy falls in love with his mother and has to confront his father. And when he realizes that he can't overcome his father's power, then he identifies with the father and becomes the father, and in that way gains sort of access to the mother. He becomes a man. And then he goes out of the world and marries a girl just like the girl who married dear old dad. Oedipus argued that this was the driving development of human growth and human development, human personality, and it's also the driving drama of human civilization. He argued that civilization began when the sons overcame the father, killed off the father, and then projected the father's personality into the sky in the guise of God, and then reappropriated that father, who art in heaven, as the voice of superego, the source of conscience. So that the Oedipus complex, the conflict between sons and their fathers, is really what drives human history. The Bible has a different idea. The Bible argued that the driving dynamic of human history is the relationship between brothers. The rivalry between brothers for the father's blessing is what drives history. And if you look, for example, at the book of Genesis, the book of Genesis is organized around 6 brother stories. Cain and Abel, the sons of Noah. Abraham, his brother's dead, so his surrogate is Lot, the nephew. Isaac and Ishmael, which is the story we're talking about today. Jacob and Esau, the story we read about yesterday in the Torah. And the brothers of Joseph, the sons of Jacob. And then if you want to go to a 7th, which is always a good number in the Bible, one could actually see that the rivalry between Moses and Pharaoh is a brother story. For after all, Moses was raised in the palace as a prince. So he and Pharaoh, in a certain way, are brothers. This driving dynamic of the brothers is going to be one of the background stories of today's conflict. So you don't have all the text. You have a page of text. But before we get to the text you get, let's go back to the Ur text, the underlying foundational text of this. I'll read it to you. Don't worry. You don't have it. It's in the 4th chapter of Genesis, if you happen to have a Bible. I don't know. It's Sunday morning. You might have a Bible. I don't know. Now the man knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and bore Cain. Adam and Eve have just been thrown out of the garden. This is the very next story. And she says, I've gained a male child with the help of the Lord, and she bore his brother Abel. Abel became a keeper of sheep. Cain became a tiller of the soil. In the course of time, Cain brought an offering to the Lord from the fruit of the soil, and Abel, for his part, brought the choicest firstlings of the flock. So this story begins, this is to some chagrin to guys like me, it begins with the impulse toward religion. Both of them have had a good year, and they want to offer gratitude to God, so they each bring an offering. Cain is a farmer, he brings vegetables. Abel is a shepherd, he brings a sheep. He brings the carcass of an animal. And here's the interesting line. The Lord paid heed to Abel and to his offering, but to Cain and his offering he paid no heed. And Cain was much distressed, and his face fell. And God says to him, what's your problem? Why are you so upset? And then the next story is very strange. It's very sort of elliptical. Cain said to his brother Abel, and there's an ellipse in the text. There's a gap in the text. It doesn't tell us what they were talking about. And when they were in the field, Cain set upon his brother Abel and killed him. The Lord said to Cain, where is your brother Abel? And Cain responded, I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper? Hashomer achi anochi. Am I responsible for him? Now, here's the interesting thing. This is the foundational story. The first 2 born brothers in the world, one kills the other. Why? Why did he kill him? It says in the text they both brought an offering, and the Lord respected the offering of Abel, but not the offering of Cain. How would you know? How would you know that? Well, think for a moment. They each build an altar. They build this big roaring fire. Cain puts a whole grill full of vegetables on his fire. Abel puts the carcass of a sheep on his fire. What's going to happen? They're going to burn. There's going to be smoke. The smoke is actually the offering. It's the sweet-smelling smoke. In which direction is the smoke going to go? In all cases. except if there's a wind, in which case they'll both blow. In other words, you couldn't know empirically whether God accepted your offering or not. When it says the Lord paid heed to Abel's offering, but to Cain's offering he paid no heed, what we're being told is not something that is empirically, objectively happening. We're being told something that looks like what's happening in the eyes of Cain. Cain says, Dad likes you more. God loves you more. And this becomes the whine of every brother who's ever lived. His piece of cake is bigger than mine. His estate is bigger than mine. His wife is prettier than mine. His life is better than mine. Why don't I have what he has? This is going to be the fundamental conflict within human history. You look across the other side and say, he's got more than me. How come I don't have more than him? And there is the whine of the victim. We call that in our house the art of fine wine. But Mom, but this is going to escalate in each of the successive generations. Noah's going to have the problem with his sons. Abraham and Lot are going to have to separate. We'll see the Ishmael story in a minute of Isaac and Ishmael. As I said yesterday in synagogue, we read the story of Jacob and Esau. Jacob steals the birthright from his brother. And his brother returns from the hunting trip, bringing the meal that the father had requested. And the father says, who are you? And he says, I'm Esau, your firstborn. And he says, well, then who is it who just took the blessing? And he's blessed, and I can unbless you. And then comes the cry of the brother. It's the most plaintive cry in the Bible. Aesop says to his father, have you but one blessing? And this I would submit to you, this is a critique of monotheism. At least it is a critique of a misinterpretation of monotheism. That one God means there's only one blessing for one brother. And that everyone else is left out. That this is a choosing monotheism. The idea that there's only one blessing for one brother makes for terrible families and makes for a world full of war and conflict. This is the Bible's own internal self-critique of its monotheism. And this is at the heart, the first step of our conversation today. Because this is a conflict between two brothers, between Isaac and Ishmael. And who is going to receive the blessing? Who is going to inherit the responsibilities of covenant? Who is going to merit taking the place of Abraham? Now let's jump, number 2, to the Abraham stories. The Abraham stories begin, I gave you this piece here, if you look on your sheet, it says Genesis 12. Abraham was 75 years old when the Lord God showed up in his life, and we don't know anything about his backstory except what the Midrash makes up. And the Lord said to Abram, go forth from your native land and from your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you, and all the families of the earth shall bless themselves by you. This is a wonderful story. First of all, this is a story that's familiar to all of you. It was familiar to the people who read it the first time, because this is the story that is repeated and reiterated in every earthly mythology. You find this story in Mesopotamian mythology, you find this story in Greek mythology, you find this story in Polynesian mythology, you find this story in Native American mythology. The god chooses a hero and says, you're going to be my guy. You're going to fight my battles, and I'm going to make you great. And the Torah knows that you know all those mythologies. The Torah knows that you've read Joseph Campbell.
Andre was very nice.
And that you know that this is the same story in Polynesian and Native American and Viking mythology and European mythology and Greek mythology and Mesopotamian mythology. But the Torah is going to wink at you. Watch. It's going to do what you expect. I will make of you a great nation. Well, all the gods say that. And I will bless you. That's nice. I'm leaving home, after all. I'm giving up everything for you. And I will make your name great. That's what I expected too. But the next line occurs in no other earthly mythology. V'heyeh bracha, be a blessing. In return for this prerogative, this responsibility, this place in God's world, you have a responsibility. Be a blessing. It says, you shall be a blessing. It's a command form. It's not a prediction. It's a command. You will be a blessing. Go out and be a blessing. And then because everything in the Bible has to be repeated twice, because Jews never hear the first time, it says it again. I will bless those who bless you. That's nice. I will curse those who curse you. I'm going to have a bumper sticker written like that. I think you need that for the 405. And all the families of the earth shall bless themselves by you. You will be the blessing resident in the world. You are the vessel, the channel of divine blessing into the world. That's the Abrahamic blessing. That's the Abrahamic role. That's the job description of the Jewish people. Now, Abraham takes off and he follows God into this new land. And we're going to discover that in the Abraham stories, there's two lines of narrative. Two lines of narrative. One line of narrative follows the story of covenant. That is the developing relationship between Abraham and God. The other line of narrative follows the family. The family. Now, those of us who grew up in Jewish homes and Jewish families and have grown up in the Jewish world take for granted the idea that God enters the world through a covenant that is family-based. That it's at home where you learn spirituality. That it's at home where you celebrate the important holidays. That it's at home where you learn the values of your community and your people. But this is not an obvious thing. In 1990, the Dalai Lama, the leader of Tibetan Buddhism, invited a group of Jewish leaders to come to Dar es Salaam in India, where he lives in exile, in order to talk about what he could do to keep Tibetan Buddhism alive as long as they were exiled from Tibet. Serious issue for the Tibetans. And he knew that the Jews have been alive in exile for 2,500 years. We know how to do this. So he invited a group of, it's a wonderful book, by the way, called The Jew and the Lotus, that was written up by Roger Kamenetz. People like Yitzhak Greenberg and Joy Levitt and Zalman Schachter Shlomi came to talk to him. And the Dalai Lama learned one thing, which he'd never understood before, that the secret to Jewish survival in exile is the home, is the family. The notion of a Jewish family. There's no such thing as a Buddhist family. Buddhists don't have seders. And if they do, I don't know how good the food would be. Buddhists don't have sukkahs. Buddhists don't have Hanukkah. Buddhists don't have mezuzahs on their doors. And the Dalai Lama learned that if he was going to preserve Tibetan Buddhism outside of their native land in Tibet, they better learn how to do that. That's what the Jewish leaders taught them. This is not an obvious idea, that family is the container of God in the world. I'll give you a second example, which is closer to home. The Christian tradition imagines God incarnate in a human being who walks the world. Not in the family, but in the human being. And he has no family. He has a mother who worries about him, but he has no family. And his disciples all leave behind their families in order to follow him. And at least in one of the major expressions of Christian faith, the leadership is celibate and not married into families. Now think about that for a moment. That means that family is not in that church the principal carrier of God into the world. Well, that plus the fact that you couldn't have a guy who claimed inerrancy if he had a wife, you know? No guy could be infallible if he's married. Can you imagine that, you know? Hey, Mr. Infallible, where are your car keys, you know? Mr. Infallible, you left the toilet seat up again.
Okay, he's hitting new levels.
It's true.
I don't have anything like that. Nothing.
So what you have is that it's these two lines of tradition, of narrative, and they bump into each other. Look at the second text. Abraham has this remarkable religious vision. God enters his life in the most visible and powerful and palpable ways. Fear not, Avram, I am a shield to you. Magen Avraham, the shield of Abraham. Your reward will be very great. And what's Abraham's response? He says, you know, God, all I want is a kid. You can have your seashore full of sand. I want a kid. Abraham said, "O God, what can you give me, seeing that I shall die childless? And one in charge of my household is Damascus Eliezer. I got this guy working for me, and if I die childless, he inherits, including the covenant. Since you've granted me no offspring, my steward will be my heir." The Lord came to him in reply and said, "That one shall not be your heir. None but your own issue shall be your heir." So he took him outside and said, "Look toward the heavens and count the stars, if you're able to count them." And God said, "So shall your offspring be." And because he put his trust in the Lord, he reckoned it to his merit. God says to Abraham, "You're the man." Abraham says, "Great, I need an heir. I need someone to carry this forward. I have no children. And my wife is getting up in years. And Viagra won't be invented for another 2,500 years. I need some help here." And God says, "Don't worry, your children will be as the stars in the sky and the sand on the beach." And Abraham says, "Great, I want one. Just one kid. Call him Bill, I want my boy Bill. Just give me one." God says, "No, you will be the father of many nations." Abraham says, "Fine, one. But it's getting desperate. The clock is ticking down. And now, it says that he trusted God. But he decides, and his wife decides, that they're going to sort of push the system. Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had an Egyptian maidservant whose name was Hagar. So if God's not going to give us the heir, let's figure this out on our own. Sarai said to Abraham, "Look, the Lord has kept me from bearing. Consort with my maid. Perhaps I shall have a son with her." And Abraham heeded Sarai's request. So Sarai, Abram's wife, took her maid, Hagar the Egyptian, after Abram had dwelt in the land of Canaan 10 years, and gave her to the husband as concubine. And he cohabited with Hagar, and she conceived. Don't try this at home. The people on this stage are trained professionals. We know what we're doing. We've got 3 gifted lawyers and a rabbi. Do not go home and say, "The rabbi said it was okay, And the au pair is mighty good looking, Please do not try this at home. All right, so we have several issues to unravel. Now, issue number 1. In the Bible, at least in Genesis, the children are given by God. And in order to show us that the children are magic children, are miracle children, they're born of barren women. Virgin birth is the Christian's idea. That was a Greek idea. We don't have virgin birth in the Jewish tradition. That was their idea. They have a holiday coming up. You might know about that. In our tradition, each of the mothers is barren. Sarah's going to be barren. Rebecca's going to be barren. Rachel's going to be barren. Later, we're going to hear the mother of Samson, the mother of Shmuel. Over and over again, this is the pattern. The woman can't bear. She's infertile. She has infertility issues. And it's only after a prayer to God and a miracle of God that, as it were, that they say the womb opens and the baby is conceived. This is an indication that the child to be born is a miracle child. It's a gift of God. It's our way of saying this kid carries a special mandate of divine blessing. That's the first issue. Second question. This notion of the maid. In biblical law, women can have one of 4 different statuses. The highest status is wife. A man marries a wife of his own social status. Often those marriages are not for love, but rather to bind tribes together, to create a super tribe of heirs, to make treaties, but the wife is always a woman of his own social status. Then there's a handmaid. A woman comes into a marriage with a maid, a lady in waiting. The husband may have sexual relations with that woman. She becomes part of the household, and therefore sexual relations with that woman are permitted as long as the wife agrees, and the children of that relationship become heirs to the householder, to the man. So while she has a lower status, she is not of the same status as the wife. She comes from a lower social caste. She becomes a sort of semi-wife. She becomes part of the community and part of the household, and she's protected. She's given a share in the household, and her heirs and the children she bears become heirs to the fortune and part of the household. They become sons of a lesser wife. Third is something called a concubine. A concubine is a woman of yet a lower social caste who the householder is permitted to bring into his household as long as he promises to protect and feed and care for her. He may not sell her on the open market as a slave. She becomes part of the household. She's not a wife, and her children do not become heirs. Her children do not inherit the fortune, but they are protected and educated in the household and then go on from there. And then the lowest form of woman is either slave or prostitute. Prostitute in the Bible is not a moral indignation. It's not a moral castigation. A zonah is a woman who fulfills a social need in the community. Right? The word zonah from the same word we have as mazon, meaning food. She is the woman at the inn. Right? So you get your meal and your bed and your woman, and you pay for it in one package deal. She is not part of anybody's household. She is not protected, and any children that she bears that has no relation to the householder. So what is happening here is that Hagar is a handmaid, and she is being allowed to have sexual contact with Abraham, sexual intimacy with Abraham, in the idea that if she bears a child, that child will be an heir to Abraham. Will be an heir to Abraham. Now here is the question of biblical law, which I don't know if our lawyers are going to take up, but here's the question. Really? If a handmaid has a child, and then subsequently the wife has a child, does the wife's child have a primary claim on the estate than the handmaid's child? And that's somewhat ambiguous in the text. What's also ambiguous in the text is the third issue going on here, which is the issue of primogeniture. Now, I'm a firstborn, so I'm about to lose a lot. Primogeniture in the Bible said that the oldest inherits a double portion from the father, and the oldest inherits any special status of the father. So he inherits a double portion of the estate, plus if the father has any particular special status as royalty, then the oldest inherits that too. That's why poor Charles, who turned 65 this year, has been waiting all these years, while his two siblings went off and got jobs, you know. The Bible, however, because it's trying to say something about the way God works in history, the Bible confounds primogeniture over and over and over again. Abraham was not the oldest. Isaac is not going to be the oldest. Jacob is not going to be the oldest. Joseph is not the oldest. Moses is not the oldest. David is not the oldest. Solomon is not the oldest. Why? Because the Bible is trying to say that when you live in a world with a God who is active in history, then the conditions of history are plastic. They can be molded and shaped according to standards, not necessarily who was born first. So in the Jacob story, Jacob is given the blessing over Esau, even though Esau is older than him, because Jacob is deemed more worthy than Esau. Joseph and Judah will be deemed more worthy than Reuben, who is the firstborn of the family. Moses is more worthy than Aaron, who will have an important role, but it will be a secondary role. Jesse has eight sons. David is the youngest, but he's the one who's more worthy. And the notion that one is more worthy, inherits the special status of the father, is part of this notion that you live in a world with a God of history. That these are God's decisions, not to be made simply automatically by legal mechanisms. So now we come to the issue. Hagar is now pregnant, and there's turmoil in the household because Sarah still has her problem of infertility. And Sarah hates her and sends her out of the house. You can read this in the few minutes you're together. And then you'll discover that, if you'll turn the page over, please, an angel comes and says, go home. Go back to your mistress. And now we have the denouement of the story. 3 angels come to Abraham one afternoon, and one of them announces that he's about to be a father with Sarah. Now he's 100, she's 90. Mazel tov. And she actually says, have you seen him? And God says, what'd she say? have you know, that's why he was called Yitzchak, because he laughed. Yitzchak means laughter. The Lord took note of Sarah as he promised. I'm in the middle of the page, please. And the Lord did for Sarah what he had spoken. And Sarah conceived and bore a son in his old age, at the set time that God had spoken. Abraham gave the newborn son, whom Sarah had borne him, the name Isaac. And when Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him as God commanded. And Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born. And Sarah said, God brought me laughter. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. It's an interesting question. What kind of laughter? Now, the problem is, now you have a blessing, but blessings often bring complications. And the complication is, well, what do you do with that kid? And besides, which one is more worthy to inherit the blessing that Abraham is to bring into the world? So take a look with me. Sarah saw the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham. Now, the Hebrew word is mitzachek. Mitzachek. The kid's name is Yitzchak. Mitzachek is a verb form of that. Now, what does mitzachek mean? Literally, it means playing, fooling around. But it's something that got her upset. So the commentators begin to imagine, what could he have been doing? And what did he reveal about his character in doing so? Some commentators say that he was trying to kill Isaac. Mitzachek, meaning he was trying to supplant his younger brother. Other commentators say that there was a sexual thing involved, that he was trying to take his brother sexually. Other commentators, there are all sorts of imaginations, but we don't know. It's something about what Ishmael was doing, and Sarah notices. But that's not really the issue. Whatever he was doing, the question is, which kid is going to inherit? And that becomes somewhat problematic, because Ishmael is technically the firstborn. She said to Abraham, cast out that slave woman and her son, for the son of that slave shall not share the inheritance with my son Isaac. The matter distressed Abraham greatly. Why? Because that's his firstborn son. Because he had bonded with this kid. Because he's not a murderer. Because this is not him. And because family stuff is, Abraham doesn't come by family stuff easily. He doesn't listen. He doesn't have a capacity to feel the tension in his own family. Covenant stuff he's good at. Family stuff, not so good. But God said to Abraham, do not be distressed over the boy or your slave. Whatever Sarah tells you, do as she says, for it is through Isaac that offspring shall be continued through you. As for the son of the slave woman, I will make a nation of him too, for he is your seed. So God says to Abraham, listen to your wife, which of course is what Jewish men have been doing ever since. This is not so easy to do. After all, this is his son. And while he's not married to this woman, he obviously has affection for her. In fact, there is a tradition that said that when Sarah dies, he went back to Hagar. There's a tradition in that direction. So early the next morning, Abraham took some bread and some skin of water and gave them to Hagar and placed them over his shoulder, together with the child, and sent them away. And she wandered about the wilderness of Beersheba. Anyone ever been to Beersheba? Yes. What is Beersheba like? Well, think Lancaster without the glory. It's sort of Mojave without all the art, you know? It's a brutal, dry, lifeless, dangerous desert. It's not a sand desert like the Sahara. It's a rock desert like the Mojave. So sending a woman by herself, a rather young woman, and the child into the wilderness of Beersheba is doing what? It's sending them to death. It's sending them to death. And the question is, why is he doing this? And is this the right thing to do? Does he trust in God's promise? Does he know what he's doing? That's what you're going to have to listen to the lawyers about in a minute. Early the next morning, he sends them out. He places them over his shoulder together with the child. She wandered in the wilderness, and when the water was gone from the skin, she left the child under one of the bushes and went and sat down at a distance a bow shot away, for she thought, let me look on as the child dies. And there's something pathetic about this. Something pathos. I'm not going to watch my kid die in the desert. And sitting afar, she burst into tears, and God heard the cry of the boy. Interesting, heard the cry of the boy, not hers, but his. And an angel of the Lord called to Hagar from heaven and said, what troubles you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heeded the cry of the boy where he is. Come, lift up the boy and hold him by hand. I will make a great nation by him. And then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She opened her eyes and saw, the woman is dying of thirst in the desert. She puts the kid under a bush. She walks away some yards. She sits down and she says, I don't want to watch my kid die. The angel comes and says, don't worry, you're going to survive, and he's going to be somebody great. And suddenly she opens her eyes, and what's there? A well. Was it there all the time? Are there some times when you're in such deep distress that you don't notice the well of water that's right there in front of you? When the distress is so deep that you don't understand where you really are at that moment, and that you are in a place of possibility and fertility and a possibility of life, because death has so taken your soul. The well was always there. It was her eyes needed to be opened. And the story is about opening eyes. And now the eyes of this woman are open, and she saw the well, and she went and filled the skin and gave the boy to drink. And God was with the boy, and he grew up and dwelled in the wilderness and became a bowman. And he lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother got a wife for him from the land of Egypt. And then we find out that he becomes a great man and the father of some nations. What did Abraham do? And what Abraham did the right thing to do? And is this an example, or is this an aberration? And this is what the lawyers are going to argue for you in a few moments. Let me just finish the story so you don't walk away irresolute. Something amazing is going to happen at the end of the story. Remember that after this story, there's going to be another story. God is going to come again to Abraham and tell him to do what for Isaac? Take Isaac, your son, your only one, the one you love. Take him to the land of Moriah and offer him there on one of the mountains that I will show you. And Abraham takes him up to the mountain, and he begins to offer him there. This is a man with a problem, you know. He had two sons, and he tried to off both of them. And both of them grow up wounded. Both of them grow up wounded. They grow up wounded from this choice, the choice of Isaac over Ishmael, and they grow up wounded over what's going to happen to Isaac. And one could make a good drasha, if one wanted, that we today still live with the wounds that were inflicted in these stories. That sense of, I'm not the one who's loved, I'm not the one who's blessed, I'm not the one who was given favor, I'm not the one who was chosen, and therefore there's a great rage and hate inside of me. There's only one redeeming thing here. One really redeeming story, which is at the end, and it's not in your text, and I'll just read it to you. It's so very quickly, and it's so very interesting. And what happens is, Abraham is going to die. He's going to die a good old man with lots and lots of children from his second and third wives. He's going to die a man blessed by God, a man satisfied with the work and the life that he's lived. He's going to die, and guess who's going to come to bury him? The Torah says Isaac and Ishmael came to bury their father. Isaac and Ishmael, the two sons, each of them the victims of this man's passion, are going to come, number one, together as brothers again to show respect to the father and to live together in the land of Israel. Isaac will live in Elonei Mamre, Ishmael will live in Beersheba, and they will share the land. The Torah's great faith is the faith that is expressed later in the book of Psalms, in the 131st Psalm. Hine matovu manayim, shevet achim gam yachad. How remarkable and marvelous it is when brothers can live together. Enjoy the trial.
Yeah, good morning, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. We're all here today to decide the case of people versus Abraham and Sarah. Each of these defendants has been charged with the criminal offense of child endangerment. It's my pleasure to again be here to preside over these trials. This is my fourth year in doing it. I'm honored to be here, also honored to succeed the Honorable Joe Wapner, who presided over these cases for the prior 7 years. And yes, we're in our 11th year. We thought last year, the 10th year, was going to be the end, but by popular demand, here we are again. So. One of the things that makes these trials so special are the advocates that we have here today, and I'm going to introduce them and say a few words about each of them. For the state, for the people of California, the prosecutor in this case is Professor Laurie Levenson to my right. And for the defendants, the dean of the law school at the University of California at Irvine and a professor, Professor Erwin Chemerinsky to my left. We are really lucky. These are two of the leading legal luminaries in our community, actually some of the stars of the legal and academic profession nationwide. Professor Levenson was a former prosecutor. She's been professor at Loyola Law School for the last 25 years. She's like Professor Chemerinsky, she's a prolific author, writer. Her books on criminal law and procedure are widely used. I was recently in another county in the judge's chambers, and there were her books on criminal law used by the local judge. Aside from being a commentator at local news shows, she's one of the go-to people for the media every time there's a sensational trial or some legal issue. She heads the Center for Ethical Advocacy, which we in the judicial system like to see. And she also heads a project called the Project for the Innocent. Some of you may have noticed in the LA Times in the last couple of weeks. There was a story about a convicted felon, convicted when he was 18 of the crime of murder, serving a life sentence, been in custody for 35 years, constantly protesting his innocence. Even when he's up for parole, he would never be able to acknowledge any remorse because he constantly said he didn't do it. Well, in any event, Professor Levenson or her students took an interest in this case. They devoted a great amount of time. They interviewed people that were witnesses, relatives of witnesses, looked at all the record, provided briefs to the court. In the end, as a result of their efforts, a judge freed this defendant, found that he had been wrongly prosecuted, and that individual, Cash Registers his name, is now a free person thanks to the good efforts of that group. Dean Chemerinsky, as I said, is the founding dean of this new law school. It's now in its 5th year. That's no easy feat, of course, to found a law school. It's now sought after by students all over the country. They get about 20 applications for every spot. It's been a tremendous success. Dean Chemerinsky also is a prolific author. He's written books on constitutional law. He's also been involved in community service. I even testified before his commission on charter reform when he headed that up, and that commission made some major reforms in the city government of Los Angeles. It'll also be interesting to read about the argument he will have in a couple of weeks before the United States Supreme Court on a very significant First Amendment issue. So we're very pleased to have these two extraordinary lawyers, advocates here. Now, this is a trial, although you recognize it's a little different from most trials. For one thing, all of you have paid to be jurors here. That usually doesn't happen in the LA court system, where a lot of people try to evade service, unfortunately. But I understand why you're here. And secondly, in an ordinary trial, we spend a lot of time trying to select the jury to try to find truly unbiased and impartial people. Rabbi Orrin tells me that everyone here is assured to be fair and impartial, so you're all deemed to be qualified. So we don't have to spend any time in selecting the jury. And of course, we're not having any opening statements. There's not going to be any presentation of witnesses, no live testimony. Basically, the record is what you have before you. And we're not worried about some minor technical problems. For example, the defendants no longer exist. And we're taking jurisdiction of an offense that occurred in another country. And we're not worrying about the statute of limitations. So what the heck? We're here to decide the case anyway. So without any further comments on my part, I'll now call on Professor Levenson to give the people's opening argument. Professor Levenson.
Thank you, Your Honor. And I believe there's a tech person who's going to come and help us with our machine. I always hope there's a tech person. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I am proud to be here today to represent the people, the good people, in the prosecution against Abraham and Sarah. Let me begin by acknowledging my dear friend, the outstanding Dean Erwin Chemerinsky, and Judge Pines, a good friend to all of us. So what is this case about, ladies and gentlemen? It's about the issue of whether it is okay to abandon your children. Drive them off into the wilderness, throw them to the wolves. You know, it's not like sending them to college without a credit card. We've all done that. It's really about a callous plan to get rid of one of your children because you favor another over that child. This is not morally okay, and it is not legally okay. So let's start with the charges in this case. Today we are here to put Abraham and Sarah on trial for recklessly endangering the life of Ishmael, who is Abraham's firstborn, as well as with his mother Hagar. And keep in mind exactly what these defendants did. First, need I remind you that it was Sarah's idea. And by the way, she went with an alias, Sarai, at the time. For Abram, the alias, to Abraham, to have him shtup, you know that legal term, right? Hagar in the first place. Look at him there, he's pathetic, right? He was so desperate, and Sarah was so old and withered, that he offered up Hagar to give him that child. And then, how did Sarah treat Hagar? Oh my gosh. She is cruel to her. The original Frau Farbissina, I would say. Sarah treated Hagar and the child Ishmael cruelly and selfishly, even to the point where Hagar felt like she might have to run away. And the angel said, "Put up with this woman. You're pregnant, have your son, all will be well." So Hagar goes back to Abraham and Sarah's house, and what does she do there? She cooks, she cleans, she tends the goats, she does the dry cleaning, she makes the beds, she strips the master, she bears the children. She does it all. And all is good until Sarah somehow gets herself knocked up too. Now, I understand why she might not be in the best of all moods. I mean, she's over 80 years old, not so easy to have a baby, but she did it. And that's when the real Sarah comes out. She doesn't love big love homes. She can't put up with a blended family. She sees her boys playing, Isaac and Ishmael, and the green monster of jealousy overcomes her. As it says, she said to Abraham, "Cast out that slave woman and her son, for the son of that slave shall not share in the inheritance with my son Isaac." So now you know what it's all about. It's about the money. Sarah wants to get rid of Ishmael because Isaac wants the estate, and Abraham and Sarah are willing to go along with it. Now, 1 minute before we go into that, what do we know about this Abraham defendant? As the rabbi mentioned, he's a repeat offender, right? Just look at his rap sheet. Attempted murder, when he's snipping off those schmeckles, practicing surgery without a license. He has Sarah lie about being his sister, not his wife. He breaks other people's properties, including their idols, and then he flees lech lechas from jurisdictions. That's who this defendant is. What does he do? He sends Hagar and Ishmael off into the desert. And he does this with a little bissel of bread and a little bit of water. And they're going into this big wilderness with no kiss goodbye, no call me on the cell phone if you have any problems. Just shoo, get out of here, because it's inconvenient to have you around. And where does he send them? Well, as the rabbi said, he sent them to their doom, to the brutal, dry, lifeless, dangerous desert. And that's where they're sent into, Hagar and the child. And Hagar wanders through the desert, and when she thinks that only a miracle will save her, God does send that miracle. When the water was gone from the skin and she couldn't take it anymore, she left her precious child Ishmael under a bush, and she couldn't bear to see him die. Abraham does not hear the cries, right? It is only God who hears the cries of this child. And then there is the miraculous intervention to help Ishmael survive. Now, I don't want to poison the well too much when you make your decision. But just think of what could have been if Sarah and Abraham had not pulled this stunt. Right? You know, we might have actually gotten along with our neighbors. So I think it's probably fair to say that not only are the defendants guilty of child endangerment, but they're probably responsible for the entire crisis in the Mideast today. Now, every year, I get attacked for not having the right evidence to present to you. This year, we are lucky, because this year, you don't have to believe me. We were able to actually get a deposition from one of the witnesses. And if you listen carefully, I think you will hear what really happened in this case. Please.
Sir, what is your name?
Call me Ishmael.
And how do you spell that, Ishmael?
In English or Aramaic?
Well, do you have a last name?
Son of Abraham. Ishmael, son of Abraham.
Ishmael, son of Abraham. Do you see your father in the courtroom today?
No, he ditched me long ago.
Ishmael, who was your mother?
Hagar, blessed woman. She took care of the children, cleaned the house, made the food, took care of the flock. Much more than that Sarah ever did.
Ishmael, did there come a time when your father abandoned you?
Actually, he took me out into the wilderness, my poor mother and I into the desert. He knew we didn't have food or water to survive. He didn't care. We'd been replaced by Isaac and Sarah, and the guy played favorites. And that Sarah, she egged him on.
Well, he did give you some food and water, didn't he?
Imagine being given a jug of water to cross the Mojave Desert. How would that work out for you? He didn't care. He just didn't care. He was too much of a coward to stand up to Sarah, and instead he endangered my life and that of my mother. You should own up to what he did. It was just criminal.
Thank you, Mr. Ishmael. No further questions.
So there you got it. The real evidence in the case. Just call me Ishmael. And as he said, what happened was just criminal. Ladies and gentlemen, what you're deciding today is whether these two, Sarah and Abraham, were in a conspiracy together. An agreement, basically, to commit any crime or any immoral act, and that they did any overt act, anything towards that crime. And did Sarah and Abraham do that? You bet, because they were in it together. You don't need a signed contract by them. It's enough that Abraham agreed and Sarah egged him on in this dirty deed. And what was the deed to do? Child endangerment. Let me talk about that for a minute. It's enough, frankly, under the law that the defendants were criminally negligent in causing Ishmael to be endangered. So you ask, what is criminal negligence? It does not have to be that Abraham had the intent, the purpose, to kill Ishmael. That's not the law in this case. It's enough that his acts were a gross departure from the way that an ordinary, careful person would act. That he had a disregard for human life because he and his wife were selfish. So therefore, in hearing these facts, if you say, gee, I think Abraham was pretty clueless, although I don't think he wanted to kill Ishmael, that is still child endangerment because that is all the law requires. And it also does not require that the child actually suffer. What this crime is all about is whether Abraham's actions could have led to the harm. And do you know that they could have? Absolutely. Pause for a minute. As you heard Ishmael say, you give somebody a little bread, a little water, you send them out into the Negev, and you hope for the best, a child and a mother. That's what this crime is. Now, we can anticipate a little bit the wily defenses that my esteemed opponent will come up with. They have ranged over time from blaming the victims or claiming that somehow God wants little children to suffer. But I know that you won't let your sympathies be played upon. He might argue that, well, Abraham is just misunderstood. That, in fact, all he was trying to do is have peace in the family by sending one boy to his death and the other to his fortune. But the facts speak for themselves. Abraham does what Sarah says, and he, in fact, gets rid of the boy. Why is it so important today that you find the defendants guilty? And I want to offer you up something, because I know a lot of you sit up there and year after year you're saying, please don't make me find, like, the father of the Jewish people guilty. But actually, if you want to be Jewish, really Jewish, you'll keep in mind this. If you heard this story on the outside, but it went the other way, Hagar's family decided to throw out Sarah and Isaac and put them out in the desert, what would you say? Would you let them off the hook? And if you read in the Beersheba Times in 3000 BCE, that kids and moms were being given a little bit of water and sent out to the desert where it's 120 degrees, what would you say? Would you say it's okay? And if you heard that moms were collapsing on the sand and saying, I just cannot watch my precious boy die, what would you say? Would you say it's okay? Of course not. You would say, guilty. Thank you so much.
Judge Pines, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, such a pleasure to appear before you again. It's always wonderful to be with Laurie. I wait every year to see what she's going to come up with this year. Ishmael looked good for a guy not much over 5,700 years old. I confess to you that I don't watch reality TV. I've never seen The Real Housewives of Orange County. But I could easily imagine the following plot line there. Imagine a couple getting up in years. Let's call them Sarah and Abe. And Sarah, by the time she's in her mid-70s, realizes if she hasn't had a child yet, it's probably not going to happen. But she knows that Abe wants to have a child, someone to take over the family business. So she says, you know, we have this maid. Why don't we use the maid, Hagar, as a surrogate mother? After all, this story is the first one we know of surrogacy. Abe volunteers himself to have a child, and for many years, Sarah lives with Abe and Hagar and the child. It's a difficult situation. And then amazingly, Sarah, age 90, finds herself pregnant. Of course, any of you who are drug company executives are immediately thinking of geriatric birth control. Great market out there. But then, after a few years, the situation just becomes intolerable. And Sarah says to Abe, it's time. Hagar, son, just have to go. Is there a crime there in saying, I just can't live in this household anymore? There's no crime that's been committed in those circumstances. Now, this is a story that's ancient, but modern too. Let me pick another example. We'll call them hypothetically Arnold and Maria. They have a maid too, and that maid too has a son. Now, to all of our surprise, Arnold actually could act, and for 13 years denies that it's his son. But Maria becomes increasingly suspicious. Maybe it's the son's Austrian accent. Maybe it's every day, but when he leaves for school, he says, I'll be back. She finally figures it out, and she says, you, the maid, the son, all have to go. Is there a crime that's been committed there? There's no crime. Now, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I admit to you, I don't have a PowerPoint. I've never learned how to do PowerPoint. I didn't think to try to get depositions from Abraham and Sarah. But what I do have is a simple defense today. No crime has been committed. I just want to make 2 points this morning for you. First, Sarah and Abraham were justified in asking Hagar and Ishmael to leave. Imagine how intolerable the situation must have been for Sarah all of those years. Imagine anybody having to live in those circumstances. But Sarah put up with it until there came the point at which she saw Ishmael playing with Isaac. And as was pointed out by the rabbi, there's a great deal of interpretation that's been done in the Talmud about what the word playing means in your text. It's, of course, a different word in Hebrew than in English. Some in the Talmud say that here the word playing means fondling, implying that there was some sexual activity between Ishmael and his younger brother. Others interpret it as tormenting. Some say that it was because Sarah saw Ishmael worshiping idols. Some say it was in terms of bloodshed, what he was doing with his bow and his arrow. But the greatest scholars in Jewish history, Talmud and interpreting the Talmud, have all said that the word was not an innocuous one, playing. And in light of that, Sarah did what any mother would do, act to protect her child. And so it wasn't simply about jealousy. It wasn't about money or the birthright. It was about protecting her child. And in fact, if you look at your text, there was every reason to believe that she had to protect Isaac from Ishmael. So this is the evidence you have to go on. And it says in the first paragraph of the text you've been given, the Lord shall take heed to your suffering. He shall be a wild ass of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. In light of that, surely Sarah was justified in saying to Abraham, it's time. Hagar and Ishmael had to leave. So no one can suggest they did anything wrong by wanting Hagar and Ishmael to leave. The only question is, did they do it in a reckless way? And that's my second argument for you today. No crime was committed here. Let's be clear that no harm came to Ishmael. According to the Torah, he lived to be 137 years old. He had 12 children. That's a good life. But the argument here is that the way in which he and his mother were sent into the wilderness was child endangerment. Nonsense. For many reasons, it's nonsense. First, Ishmael wasn't really a child at this time. According to all the interpretations, Ishmael was about 14 years old at the time Isaac was born. This event occurred when Isaac was weaned, and according to the commentators, it was likely when Isaac was 2 or 3 years old. So when all of this occurs, Ishmael is 16 or 17 years old. Again, it's a matter of translation. The word in the Torah is yaled, which could mean a young child, but it could also mean here a young adult. In addition, Ishmael was sent out with his mother. It's not as if Ishmael was left to wander by himself in the desert. He had his mother there to take care of him. This certainly undercuts any claim of child endangerment. But perhaps most important, there is every reason to believe that Hagar and Ishmael could survive in the desert. Every reason to believe that Hagar knew she could survive there until she got to where she was going. And for this case, every reason to believe that Abraham and Sarah knew that. And I think you find that again in your text, and I think it's decisive. And you find it at the very beginning of the text. After Hagar was pregnant, we know that Sarah, according to Prosecutor Levin's words, was cruel to her. And Hagar ran away into the desert. And what happens in that desert? First line of your text. An angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the road to Shur. In other words, Hagar had run into that desert before. Hagar knew that there was water in the desert. Hagar knew that it would sustain her until she got where she was going. She didn't believe that she was in any danger. And there's every reason to believe that Abraham and Sarah knew that the water was there, and therefore that Abraham and Sarah knew that there was no danger at all. That enough undercuts any claim of child endangerment. Moreover, just to tide them over, Abraham gave them food and water. It specifically says here, Abraham took some bread and a skin of water. This undercuts any claim of child endangerment. And if they had any doubt whatsoever, God spoke to Abraham and Sarah. God told them that it would all be fine. And so it says, God said to Abraham, "Do not be distressed over the boy or your slave. Whatever Sarah tells you, do as she says. For it is through Isaac that offspring shall be continued for you." In light of all of this, no crime occurred. Now, you will be instructed by Judge Pines as to what's required in order to find child endangerment. And it's important to know that it has to be willful. It has to be likely to cause harm. In fact, if you look at the section of the law, it's titled, "Willful Harm or Injury to a Child." And it speaks of the need to show likelihood, needed to show willfulness. Where is the willfulness in causing harm? Abraham loved his children. Abraham loved his son Ishmael. Look again at the text you have been given. The matter distressed Abraham greatly, for it concerned a son of his. There was no willfulness to cause harm. There's no reason to believe he knew or should have known there would be harm. Now, what the wily prosecutor leaves out is that she has the burden to convince you. And she must convince you beyond a reasonable doubt. And the evidence in the text just doesn't permit such a conclusion. She would need to show you that Abraham didn't provide enough food, enough water to get them there. But then she'd need to show you how much food and water versus what was needed. She can't do that. She'd have to show you the fault here was Abraham and Sarah's and not Hagar's. In fact, was it that Hagar simply got lost, or was it because Abraham and Sarah acted improperly? The evidence doesn't support her conclusion. Now, she makes arguments that in any court regard highly prejudicial. She wants to tell you that the future world peace requires that you find the defendant guilty. She wants to tell you as good Jews you have to find the defendants guilty. Nonsense. Your jurors in this court of law, you can only find the defendants guilty if there's proof beyond a reasonable doubt. There's no proof of any crime. There's one and only one appropriate verdict in this case, and that's not guilty.
Professor Levenson, your rebuttal and closing argument.
A demonstration. Well, he tried. And if anybody could somehow invoke Arnold and Maria in a way to help a client, it would be my friend, Erwin Chemerinsky. But you know, there's a slight difference. There's a difference between actually paying child support and throwing your child in the desert. Not exactly the same. And actually, I was a little bit outraged, maybe you were too, when Dean Chemerinsky said there's no crime. And he mentioned two things. He said, first, that somehow Abraham and Sarah were actually justified in putting this boy's life at risk and sending him out there because we don't know, and that's what he said, we don't know what he might have been doing with Isaac. And you can guess all you want. And I want to ask you, is that the type of evidence you rely upon? We don't know? Because the verb means plain. The verb was not attacking. The verb was not killing. The verb was not molesting. The verb was just plain. And because they are so blinded by their prejudice against Hagar and Ishmael, it all of a sudden becomes sinister that this boy has to die. Was he really arguing that you could send the boys out into the desert in self-defense as opposed to stepping in and saying, don't do that to your brother? Not okay. And if it's about the inheritance, and he sent him away because of the inheritance, then that doesn't make him not guilty of child endangerment. It makes him guilty of cheating and child endangerment. The second part of what he said was, it was not reckless, right? That somehow everybody knew it would turn out okay. So I just wonder, you're sent out into the desert. Here's your meal. Here, catch, this is your meal. Try getting to Orange County with that. And here, let's see how far you get. Try to find a well in the Negev. How many of you been to the Negev? Were you tripping over wells all the time? Just couldn't get past those wells. And
you're not going to throw that bottle into the audience, are you? No.
There you go. That's it. You want the bottle? It's hard to find a bottle from those days. That's it. That's all that he could have to survive on. And somehow my friend says, well, you know what? He tries to blame the victim. It's Hagar's fault. She had been out in the desert before. Why can't she just remember her darn way every time she's thrown out in the desert? And because maybe she sent a different direction, or maybe it's harder because she has a boy in tow, and the word is a boy in tow, or maybe because she's trying to carry everything she can, because she's being sent off to a place she does not know, and maybe because God has not come to her and said, oh, this is a good trip too. Just go on this trip, right? She runs into a situation any of us could. You could be out there. You could be driving your child. Your car could break down. And someone could say, didn't you know about the station right around the mile, right around the corner? But at that moment, the text tells us what she saw. She saw her child suffering. And she thought that her child would die. And at that point, she had no reason to believe that anything other than divine intervention could help. So in this case, it's absolutely outrageous for the defense to claim, oh, you know what? God wanted this, so you can endanger your child. Because you can just imagine how sad that would be if every time a defendant showed up in a courtroom here in Los Angeles and did the unspeakable things that endanger children, they said, you know what? I thought God wanted this. I have other kids. They're doing better in their homework. They make their beds a little better. We like them a little better. So this one was okay to sacrifice up, to endanger. In this case, you have proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Remember what you have. You have Abraham, and he is reluctant, right, to send Ishmael out precisely because he knows what that means. Because he knows that unless somehow by some miracle God intervenes, this boy will die. And that is the standard for child endangerment. My friend focused on the word willfully, as if somehow that has magic meaning. But the meaning you will get from the jury instructions by the judge is not that Abraham had to have the intent to hurt Ishmael. That's not the law. The law is whether he was involved in reckless, a gross departure from the way you would want people to act with their kids. A way of whether a reasonable person, listen for those words, would send their kids out into the desert. I look at all of you, most of you look pretty reasonable. And I don't think you would do it. I don't think you'd send somebody out into the desert. I don't care if they're 5 years old or 10-year-old or frankly even 14 years old. With that water and that little bread, when there are wild beasts, there are rocks, 120-degree temperature. You know, before I end this, one thing occurred to me, and this is what he can't really address. Child endangerment doesn't plug in once the kid is dying. The endangerment began the minute that child was sent out into the desert. Because the standard is not whether the child was hurt, but the standard is whether the child could have been hurt. And everything in this text, including the language itself, says, indeed, that child, but for God intervening, could be hurt. Thank God, literally, he was not. In the end, Erwin will get the last say in this case. That's a little different from most courtrooms, right? I can't control that. You can address that. So whatever he stands up and says, I want you to be thinking, is there a response to that? You know, if I could go there, what will it be? And I want you to ask yourself, are we being asked to judge Abraham differently because he's one of ours? Yeah. That if we set this as the standard for how we treat all the children of this world, what kind of world we would have. For heaven's sakes, literally, have a little seichel. That will already distinguish you from most juries. Have a little rachmanis for the victim. And not to put it too mildly, if you love children, if you love the Torah, if you love justice, find him guilty. Thank you very much.
Dean Chemerinsky, your rebuttal and closing argument.
I am not going to throw anything at you. I'm not going to try to convince you that plastic existed 5,700 years ago. Not going to try to convince you that that roll that you have is thousands of years old. I assume that we all love children here. Of course we do. What we're talking about here is whether or not there was willful endangerment of a child. And I made two arguments to you. The first I said is that Sarah and Abraham were justified in asking Hagar and Ishmael to leave. What's interesting is how Professor Levenson rephrases the question, if you listen carefully to her words. What she says were they justified in putting them at risk? That assumes the conclusion here. What I was making with my first point is a much simpler argument, and that's that at the point at which this happened, it was entirely appropriate for Sarah to say, it's just too much, they have to go. Now, the word is playing, but in one of the documents that was sent to us, it says, quote, sages justify Sarah's behavior by interpreting the word playing as a reference to Ishmael's cruelty and lewdness, perhaps even sexual molestation. In fact, you can find that for yourself in the only evidence that you have, this text, where it says that Ishmael will be a wild ass of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. Under these circumstances, in an intolerable living situation, can anyone blame Sarah for saying, it's time for them to go? And then what you've got to ask yourself is, if that's justified, what exactly were Sarah and Abraham supposed to do? Buy them a plane ticket? Put them in a car? Give them the credit card? Of course not. So then the issue is, do you have proof beyond a reasonable doubt that the way that this was done endangered Ishmael's life? And that was my second argument to you, that no crime occurred. And what's interesting is that Professor Levenson never responds to the facts that I pointed out. That according to the Torah and the Talmud, Ishmael is 17 years old at the time, not the babe that Laurie wants to tell you about. Moreover, he's sent with his mother. He wasn't sent out just by himself into the desert. And what I said is the most important fact of all. I'm tempted to say now, I quit. She's only called more emphasis to what I think is the most important fact of all. It's what I said to you find in the first line. It says that Hagar had previously been in that wilderness and that there was water there. In fact, here I will invoke what the rabbi said to you before we began. He said that the fountain, the spring, was there all along, and she didn't see it. But if the water was there all along, Abraham and Sarah knew that it was there, then there's no willful endangerment. Then the only possible verdict is not guilty. Moreover, Abraham sent Ishmael and Hagar with bread and with water. Now, what the prosecutor wants to tell you is it was just a little piece of bread, just a little bit of water. Where do you find that in the text? Where do you find that it wasn't enough bread and water to get them to their destination? There's nothing in the text that says it was inadequate. There's no evidence to show it's inadequate. So you can't find proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Moreover, here, they were reassured by God's word. Now, I'm not saying that people can endanger their children just because they hear voices saying that. But you have the text here of God speaking to Abraham. You find in the subsequent text no indication that God ever punished Abraham and Sarah, never thought that they did anything wrong. In light of all of these circumstances, you can't say there's willful endangerment. The instructions that Judge Pines will read to you talk about how there has to be willfulness. There has to be likelihood of harm. There is no reason to believe here that Abraham and Sarah knew or should have known that there was any danger whatsoever to Ishmael or to Hagar. There is no likelihood that there would be any harm. In light of this, there is no alternative but come to the conclusion of not guilty. Everyone is against child endangerment. Everyone is for protecting children. But if you look at the evidence that you have before you, there is certainly no proof beyond a reasonable doubt, no evidence to suggest child endangerment occurred here or was even risked here. The verdict, the only appropriate verdict, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, is not guilty.
Okay, now that you've heard the argument of the attorneys, it's my job to instruct you on the law. Some of the arguments here were a little unorthodox, to say the least. But as part of these trials, I'm actually going to be instructing you on the real law in California. I first must instruct you that you're not to let bias, sympathy, prejudice, or public opinion influence your decision. You must follow the law as I explain it to you, even if you disagree with it. If you believe that the attorney's comments on the law conflict with the court's instructions, you must follow my instructions. So here are the elements of child endangerment. To prove this crime, the people must prove that first, the defendant, while having care or custody of a child, willfully caused or permitted the child to be placed in a situation where the child's person or health was endangered, and second, the defendant was criminally negligent when he or she caused or permitted the child to be endangered. Criminal negligence involves more than ordinary carelessness, inattention, or mistake in judgment. A person acts with criminal negligence when, first, he or she acts in a reckless way that is a gross departure from the way an ordinary careful person would act in the same situation. Secondly, the person's acts amount to disregard for human life or indifference to the consequences of his or her acts. And third, a reasonable person would have known that acting in that way would naturally and probably result in harm to others. A child does not need to actually suffer great bodily injury for the defendants to be guilty of child endangerment. Now, a defendant may be guilty of a crime if he or she either commits the crime or aids and abets the crime or is a member of a conspiracy. To prove a conspiracy, the people must prove, first, the defendant intended to agree and did agree to commit an act that would constitute child endangerment, and secondly, that either Sarah or Abraham committed an overt act to commit the crime. An overt act is any act committed by either co-conspirator that is done to accomplish the agreed upon crime. The overt act need not have to be criminal in itself. To prove a conspiracy, the prosecution need not prove there was a detailed or formal agreement to commit a crime. An agreement may be inferred from conduct if you conclude that members of the conspiracy acted with common purpose to commit the crime. A person who is a member of a conspiracy is guilty of all crimes committed in furtherance of the conspiracy. And last, I want to instruct you on reasonable doubt and the presumption of innocence. A defendant in a criminal case is presumed to be innocent. This presumption requires the people to prove a defendant guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Proof beyond a reasonable doubt is proof that leaves you with an abiding conviction that the charge is true. The evidence need not eliminate all possible doubt because everything in life is open to some possible or imaginary doubt. In deciding whether the people have proved their case beyond a reasonable doubt, you must impartially compare and consider all the evidence that was received throughout this trial. Unless the evidence proves the defendant guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, he or she is entitled to an acquittal, and you must find him or her not guilty. So at this time, ladies and gentlemen, do you have your verdict forms? Okay, please complete the verdict forms, and then they'll be collected. We will announce the verdict after all the forms have been counted. The court is in a brief recess, so remain here until the verdict forms are counted.
To deliver the verdict, it's my pleasure to call onto the stage Carrie Hausner. She is the chair of the Hillside Memorial Council of Directors. Please welcome her.
Thank you. On behalf of Hillside Memorial Park and Mortuary's General Manager, Paul Goldstein, and the entire staff and leadership of Hillside, we thank the AJU for continuing to involve us in this always fun, always entertaining, and always memorable event. Through the intellect and humor of these fabulous lawyers, the judge, the rabbis, they endeavor to keep the memory of our biblical characters alive and relevant today. Honoring memories is what Hillside does every single day. And now, the jury has reached a verdict. In the matter of the people versus Abraham and Sarah, the jury finds the defendants not guilty.
The verdict has been entered. The defendant is acquitted. Court is adjourned.